Hello, my name is Ashley, this is Faithful Rattos, and welcome or welcome back. So in today's video, I'm going to do something that's a little bit different than what I usually do. I'm going to answer your questions, and I'm also going to make some DIY toys at the same time. So hopefully that will be interesting for you. I have a couple of supplies here that I'm going to use to make these toys, and these are things that are cheap or free. So the first one is toilet roll middles. The second thing is nuts and shells. The third things are the remnants of chew toys that have been finished. So these were toys that I think I bought from Ratccessories, but they've been pretty much, they've been killed. So I've got these. I've also got shells. These are scallop shells that we actually had for dinner. I found them in Costco, and I thought, ooh, Rat Dad loves fish and seafood, so he'll love those. But also I can do something with these scallop shells. So we've got the scallop shells. I've got a cardboard box for one of the toys that I want to make. And I also have a drill. This is to drill holes in the shells, but also to drill holes in the nuts. So while I'm setting up the drill, I shall answer the first question. So the first question I've gotten asked is, do you find that pet shop rats are smaller than rats from breeders or well-bred rats? And I think the answer is yes, on average they can be, but that's not something that is true of all. But that's not something that is true of every single rat, if that makes sense. I'm going to start shoving toilet rolls into this box to create a foraging toy for like free roam or out of the cage time. I do think that pet shop rats have a higher chance of being smaller than well-bred rats, and there are two reasons for this. So the first reason is that at pet shops, they aren't getting proper nutrition. So the rats that are at pet shops, their mothers aren't getting fed properly, so their milk supply is going to be a little bit lackluster. But then you also have to consider that when they also start eating for themselves, they're also going to have lackluster nutrition. And often their little lives are very stressful. And so that is one reason why you can often find that pet shop rats are smaller than well-bred rats. The other one is genetics. So genetics do play a big part in how big a rat is. And if they are not being paid attention to, as is not the case in pet shops and breeding mills, then you are going to find that those rats do tend to, unfortunately, be a little bit smaller, a little bit weaker, a little bit, I like to use the word flimsy. They're just not as well equipped for life. But yes, on average, pet shop rats are smaller, but it's not like a given. Like there is some variable within that. I would say that pet shop rats have a higher chance of being smaller, but I wouldn't say that they necessarily are smaller, if that makes sense. So here is the first little toy that I've gotten. I may also close this up and put this in for dinner time, but I've just shoved a bunch of toilet roll middles into this box that can be a foraging toy. And it's really simple. You can do simple, easy things like this. Scatter food in, or even treats, or their mix, or whatever, and you can give them something really fun and enriching without breaking the bank. It's really, really easy to do that. And also, it uses the waste products that you would already have. So, for example, this box is from Fish for Dogs, and I got their protein in here for their mix. So this is a box that I bought for them. And obviously, we use toilet roll. So that's the first one. Let's do a couple of questions as I pick apart these things for my next hack. So the next question is, what is your go-to method of bonding with a new rat? And this is a tricky one, because I wouldn't say I have a go-to method, because I think it really does depend on the specific rat involved, because it really depends on their background, their personality and temperament. So If it's breeder rats that are confident when they come home, then generally I don't do anything special. I'll just give them attention when they want it. And those rats are particularly easy to bond with because they are used to human interaction. Often breeders will socialize them to different people outside of their household as well. So one of the breeders that I used in the past who doesn't breed anymore, I know that she took her babies to her D&D games. So they did get a bit of socialization with new people and new environments before they even came home. So they were often quite, hold on. Okay, this would probably help if I had the actual correct tools. So for those rats, I generally just give them the attention that they want, and they generally seem pretty happy with that. When it comes to rescue rats or nervous rats or rehomes, I really do just take it as they take it, if that makes sense. So a lot of some rats will want attention, some won't. If the rat is particularly nervous or stressy, then I'll give them a bit more time to settle in and I'll go at their pace. But if the rat is like cheeky, for example, and just straight away wanted to cuddle, then I would do that. I think I do give them a bit of what they want. Now, I obviously do want my rats to be handleable to a certain extent, just for their own safety and well-being, because if I can't handle them and they have a health issue, then that can really cause problems down the line. But that is not always the case, and often you can get them to a certain level of handleability, which is really helpful. So I do use the confidence method, but I also do use the patience method as well, and I'm cognizant to their limits because I don't want to push them further than they can go in terms of confidence and socialization and stuff like that. Because I think if you leave any sort of bonding session on a negative note, then you're kind of ruining your chances. So I do like to make sure that I'm being cognizant to where their boundaries are. The next question is Timothy hay safe to have in a rat cage? And the answer is yes. Rats are not like guinea pigs or rabbits. They won't eat Timothy hay, but they will use it for nesting material and they will have a good time with it. So I do like to use it for nesting material for them. Any sort of hay would work. I do find that hay as a nesting material does help them to smell nice, which is always good. You don't want them to smell like wee all the time. So I do like to use hay for nesting. And one more question before I start drilling. This is a juicy question. What is your opinion on self-medicating for common health issues, e.g. respiratory infections? So this is a really complex question, and I think any answer I'd give would probably upset some people. So do take my answer just as my opinion. This is not necessarily advice. This is just my opinion on the matter. I think it really depends on a lot of factors. I think it depends what the health issue is. If it's a sprain and you have pain relief at home, Metacam, something like that, I don't think it's wrong to give that if you know the correct dosage. The uncertainty comes in when it's things that are infection-based, where you want to give antibiotics, because obviously antibiotic resistance is a really big problem in veterinary medicine and in human medicine. And so I don't think people should be out here just, giving antibiotics left, right, and center. But I do think there's something to say about experienced owners or breeders or rescues doing those antibiotics themselves when they know what symptoms to be looking out for and they know the correct dosages. Now, it's not something that I would recommend that everybody does, but I do think there's certain times when it is appropriate. I have a really good working relationship with my core practice for my vets, and if it's something like a respiratory infection, she will prescribe me the medication that I need, and she will give me the whole bottle of it or the whole sheet of tablets. And she trusts me to be able to know when to use them. Now, I generally don't use them without vet's advice, if that makes sense. Usually she's giving me them medicine all at once because it's cheaper to give the medicine that way. But I always do like to second check what I think I should do with a vet. But you could class that as self-medicating because the vet isn't then re-prescribing me the medication, if that makes sense. So it really does depend on the situation, the person involved, the rat involved, the health issue. All of these things really do matter. But I do think there are certain times when it's okay, but I also think there's times when it's not. So it's really something variable. But the more common things, like giving out Metacam for, injuries or sprains, things like that, I'm not too bothered about that. I do think it's dangerous if people are whipping out antibiotics left, right, and centre. And it is illegal in the UK to buy them over the counter. They do have to be prescribed to you before you can buy them. So anybody who says they're buying it online without a prescription is doing something quite illegal and isn't something that I would recommend doing. But, there are different types of scenarios and different types of solutions to those scenarios. So that's my 2 cents. It was a pretty much of a cop-out answer, but I think in some circumstances it is okay, and in others I really wouldn't recommend it. So I already have one shell with a little hole in. But I thought I could maybe make... is this going to cut it? Oh yeah, it does cut. I thought maybe I could... that a little hazelnut would fit in here into this shell, and maybe I could have maybe a couple of nuts sort of in the middle here and this go out of the back of the shell. I'm going to try to see if I can get that to work, but that is my plan. Let's see. First, let's do a hole in the shell. There is something wrong with my drill. It may be the power. It may need new batteries. But we have our first shell here. I'm going to do maybe one different type of nut and then see how I go. I feel like I can fit toy. I've just got to curl the bottom. And there we go. There is my first little toy. I am going to make sure this bottom is secured. There is my second little toy. I'm going to give the drill a break. So for the next toy, I am going to try and drill a hole in the center of the shell. So hopefully the drill doesn't die on me. Okay. I think what's going on is I think the battery is dying. I'm going to have to not use the drill today, unfortunately. But there are a couple of other toys that I can show you without using the drill. Mainly with a trusty... So I'm going to get on with questions since my drill is clearly not working. But there are some other toys that I'm going to show you how to make with the cardboard tubes from the inside of toilet rolls, because these definitely do come in handy. And there are other ways we can use these, maybe in a different video. So the next question is, what was your first cage setup like? I didn't say first in the question, but I think this is what they were insinuating. Now, my first cage setup was particularly bad, and it's quite embarrassing, but our first cage setup was a guinea pig cage from Pets at Home, and there was nothing really in it. There was the hide that came with the cage already, and I think that's like pretty much it. I don't think there's really anything going on, especially at first. Now, I first started with the Back to Nature pellets on the bottom of the cage because of what I was recommended by Pets at Home. And then Cade got a respiratory infection, and I was recommended to use towels by the vet that I went to, which were not very rat savvy at all. And then I switched to what was called Finicard, which doesn't exist anymore, but it was a cardboard shaving bedding. And that went okay, but the cage itself still wasn't very good. And so I eventually switched over to the cage that you see in the videos on my channel right back at the start. And my layout was better, but not great. And over the years, it has improved. And I'm going to show you some photos of these cages that I did have. If you go over to my Instagram, I do have a highlight of all of my cages from as far back as like 2021, and you can definitely see the improvement in my cages and in my rat care in general. So I would recommend this toy. What I've just done here is I've got one toilet roll tube, folded up a couple of others, and put them in. And now I can use this for a foraging toy for dinner time. I just sprinkle in food into those holes, and voila, we've got a really cool, neat foraging toy. So I'm going to make a couple more of these while I answer the questions. Why did you initially decide to own rats? And the reason we initially decided to own rats was because of Rat Dad. So he had rats when he was a teenager. Unfortunately, they were alone because they were missold the rats by the pet shop, and his rat, she was called Scabbers, she ended up being pregnant, and they had babies, and his brother had the other rat, and that was a male. So he had experience of rats from a child, and he had a really close bond with Scabbers, and she was really special and important to him. So when we moved in together, we had been in a long distance relationship for almost 5 years. So when we moved in together, we really wanted to get a pet, but our landlord wanted an extra deposit for cats, dogs, that sort of pet, but he allowed caged pets without an extra deposit. And so we were thinking about what sort of animals would fit into that, and we came to the conclusion that rats would fit into that, and that is a pet that we would like to have together. And so yeah, that's how we came to the conclusion that rats were for us. I didn't really have any opinions on rats before we got them. I didn't like them, but I also didn't hate them. They were just, a pet that I'd never had. As a child, I had hamsters, and my brother had rabbits. And I didn't really have any other pets aside from those hamsters and the rabbits as a child. So I really wasn't like the pet person. So we just went with what was familiar to Rat Dad, and the rest is history, as they say. Next question. One piece of advice for new owners. My biggest piece of advice for new owners is to do research, just to do research. And so this piece of advice is a little bit sneaky, because this piece of advice can then mean that all the other pieces of advice that I would give are found out. I think the most pressing one that I would say, aside from care and everything like that, is that you really should have a vet fund to be able to pay for vet situations right from the start. But you also should have a vet practice that you know is rat savvy and that you trust before you get rats, because you don't want to think about it, but your rats can have issues right from the very start. And I have unfortunately experienced this before. I have experienced baby rats with really, really significant health issues. And if I had found a decent vet practice before, I think it would have been way easier for me to get them adequate care and perhaps change the outcome of the situation, which is a really sad thought, but it is something to consider. Somebody asked, what cages are you going to use for maternity/babies? So I am not 100% set on this yet, as things can change, but I will be using most likely Alaskas for pairing, for birthing and for the first couple of weeks. And then when they get to about 3 weeks or so, or 4 weeks or so, depending on how advanced they are, then I will move them up into a bigger cage. So I do have on hand, I have a Coco Large and I also have a Freddy 2 Max, which are really great cages for that grow out stage. And then obviously the boys and girls will be separated from each other around 4.5, 5 weeks old. And so then they will need to stay in separate cages for the last couple of weeks. So that is my plan. It could change. I am always on the lookout for cheap cages I can get, or the hamster cages I can pull out of circulation to use for, hospital cages and stuff like that, because obviously they are not adequate housing and people still think that they are. So yeah, that is my plan for maternity cages. Different people use different things. Some people like to use smaller cages right at the start. So a small hamster cage for the first couple of weeks until the babies open their eyes. But I do think it would be nice for the mums to have a bigger space to explore and do their thing without having to worry about the babies being so nearby to them. But it's not something that I'm set in stone yet, because I think it really does depend on how I feel. Lots of breeders do things differently, and that's perfectly okay, as long as obviously the rats are getting their needs met. But the purpose of maternity cages is to keep the mum and the babies safe. So maternity cages can't be too high. They can't have hammocks and things like that in, because if a mum rat is, what walks off the nest and goes to a hammock to sleep, but there's a baby still attached to her nipple and she forgets about the baby in the hammock, then the baby will probably die of hypothermia or being forgotten about when it comes to feeding. So yeah, it is really important to consider your cage setup when it comes to maternity. So I have thought about it quite a bit, as pairing is coming up rather soon, which is very exciting. Now, the next question is also breeding related. And this question is, how will you pick keepers? Which I think is a really interesting question. And again, I'm not 100% sure how I'm going to get to this point when it comes to picking keepers. I will say that, especially for my first litters, I'm probably going to be picking them a little bit later on so I can see how they develop, and so I can notice trends about how babies at 4 weeks will develop into babies at 7 weeks old. I will be picking based on need. So for example, I'm going to need more does most likely than bucks. So I'm going to be picking based on sex. I'm also going to be picking based on temperament. My preferred temperament in a rat is the affectionate and sweet ones, but they also have a naughty streak to them that like exploring, that like doing ratty things. That is also really important to me. So that's what I would lean more towards in terms of temperament. But type is also something to consider. And I do really want my rats to have solid type, a nice head, eyes and ears, and that sort of stuff. So that will be on my mind. And then as well as that, also the varieties are important, because with the varieties that I'm going to work with, I can't just pick all Burmese or all Wheatons. I do need to keep back some Siamese as well, so I don't end up getting too many sables, which is not something that I want to breed for, that I want to aim for. So that is an important thing to consider as well. I also will maybe have in the mix Dumbo and Rex in the future. So that will also depend, because the Rex that I'm going to be working with is the dominant Rex. And so that means I need to be keeping back Rexes if I want Rex to stay in the line, because that's not something that will be recessive. If I select away from Rex, then it's not going to be there. Dumbo is a little bit different. It is recessive, so that doesn't matter as much, but it is something that I do want to keep in the line for variety. So yeah, it's a very complicated thing, but I have read a really interesting book that is called The Rat's Whiskers. That is by a lady called Annette Rand, and she used to be a breeder here in the Midlands of the UK. She used to be really involved in Midlands Rat Club. And she wrote this book about one specific set of litters that she had, and the whole entire process from pairing and deciding which parents to use until the babies were going home. And she even had updates from the homes that they went to. And so in that book, she was talking about how she was deciding which rats to keep based on which sexes and stuff that she needed to keep and all that sort of stuff. And it was really interesting. And she did her own little mini rat show, which was really interesting to read about, and I think something that a lot of breeders will do something similar to. So I will be considering that. And another thing to note is that I will probably be also asking opinion of other people, especially as a new breeder just getting into it. I do want to have other people's opinion on the rats that I select. And so I may ask some of my friends to help me with that, to maybe come over, or maybe I can bring my rats to them and we can sort of discuss the different rats and the different possibilities of selecting keepers. But since it will be my first time, I really don't know how exactly it's going to go, and it really will depend. But there are lots of things to consider when selecting keepers, and it's not just looks and variety. It's not just type, and it's not just temperament. All of these things are really, really important. You do obviously have your own level of priorities. Now, for some people, health is a bigger priority. For some people, temperament is a bigger priority, and it really does depend on the situation, I think. So it's going to be a bit of a complex decision, and I can imagine it's going to be a difficult one to pick the ones that I want to keep when the time comes, but we'll see. We'll see. The next question is, do you have any other pets? And the answer is yes, but they're inverts. So you may have seen previous videos where I talked about them on my channel, but I do keep isopods. I have 2 species. I have a dairy cow species, and I also have tropical greys. Now, I keep my tropical greys as a colony to use in my bioactive cages, and I do have the dairy cows. I don't use them in the cages because they're too big and they would definitely just get eaten by the rats. The tropical greys are a little bit smaller. I love the dairy cows. I love watching them scuttle around in their enclosure. I actually bought that when I bought my first little Zuventura cage from Lisa, who used to run Lovecraft Rattery Stud, and they are wonderful. I really do enjoy those little guys. I do have those, and I also have Indian stick insects, which I got from M from Pets of Space. She sent me eggs last year, and so those hatched, and now the stick insects that I have are first generation in my care stick insects. So I guess you could say I was a stick insect breeder before I was a rat breeder, but I have about 35 nymphs at the moment. So if anybody in the Midlands wants stick insects, I have plenty if you want some. But yeah, that is the pets that I have. So I kind of answered this question already, but the next question is, what is your favorite behavior trait in a rat, e.g. cheeky, cuddly, lazy, energetic? So I like a very middling type of rat. I like the rats that are affectionate and like to be around people, but I also do like them to have an adventurous side and a side where they like to get up to mischief and do things they're not supposed to do. In my mind, the best sort of rat with the best temperament that I can sort of put my mind to that encapsulates this middling temperament that I'm talking about is my rat Aldwin. He was cheeky and naughty and got himself into trouble all the time, but he was super affectionate. He was licky all throughout his life. He would sit on your shoulder for a little bit of a cuddle, and then as he got to an old man, he was particularly cuddly. And that is my favorite type of rat, that sort of middle of the ground where they are affectionate and loving. They also have lots of stuff of their own to do. Now, don't get me wrong, I do love rats when they love to cuddle. They are especially cute and really special. My rat Cheeky that I have at the moment, she is exactly this type of rat. She is super cuddly, but she does also have an adventurous and a side to her where she likes to explore. And I think that's very important. Often people focus on this human-oriented side of the temperament, and they also lose that drive and passion that rats have just to be rats. And I think it's really important that they still have that within them, as well as being affectionate to their owners. One of the last questions somebody asked is, are there any cliques among them? And I think this is referring to my groups of rats. Are there any cliques or subgroups? And I don't think I really have this currently. I think it may be more obvious in bigger groups. Now, I haven't noticed this in my rats. I don't know if this is a my rat situation or if it's because my groups are slightly smaller. My girl group has 11 and my boy group currently has 6. So in my boy group, there's not really room for a clique, I don't think. There possibly would be in my girls' cage, but I don't tend to find that in my experience. I do find that rats do like to stay in their pairs that they came in, but they also do mix as well and get along with other rats. One thing I will say that I found is that the older rats of the group, when they're getting to be 20 months, 2 years plus, then they tend to settle down and become like a married couple sort of situation. That happened in my doe group. RK, my neutered buck, was in there, And when Temple and Roz were still around, they were my oldies of the group at the time. They were like just a little married couple, and they would just look around and look at all their children. But yeah, I haven't really experienced cliques in my rats or anything like that. And the last question is asking me about my thoughts on wheeltail, which is a really interesting topic. So they say, I have a girl who runs all night and she has a curled up tail. If she runs on a 12-inch wheel, is it dangerous? I will say the minimum wheel size for a rat is 12 inches, but I do think there are a lot of cases where 12 inches is not big enough. So I would use 12 inches for small does and for babies, but it's not something that I would use in a book cage, for example. I think you are much better getting 16-inch wheels than you are any other size because they're much more versatile. Smaller rats can use 16-inch wheels, but the bigger rats can't use the smaller wheels. Some people will say that 14-inch is okay for does, but I would always say 16 is better. I do have 16 and 14-inch wheels. 14 is good for does, but it's not necessarily going to be big enough for some of the bigger bucks or even bigger does. So it is something to consider. I don't know how big your rat is, so how she fits on the 12-inch is not something I can sort of tell without seeing it. But I will say that wheeltail is not necessarily caused by wheels either. Rats do hold their tails up sort of a bit like an antenna at the end when they run, so that does make up part of it. They're not going to keep their tail completely straight because they don't do this when running anyway. However, if it's something that is causing her pain or discomfort or is impacting her mobility, then it is something to consider going to the vet about. But I will say that most often wheeltail is actually genetic, and it's just a genetic deformity of the tail. So it really does depend on your girl. Did she start off that way or did it develop? And I think that's really important to consider because sometimes a too small wheel can cause damage, but oftentimes wheeltail is actually genetic and not caused by the wheel. I hope that helps. So, before I go, I'm going to make a couple more toys. So now I am cutting up these tubes into little strips like this. Okay? I've got strips, and I'm going to put on the inside a nut. And then what I'm going to do is put these little things around the outside to create an even more challenging foraging toy. So this has a nut inside, and this can be really fun for your rats. I'm going to go ahead and make another one of those. This is also something you can put their mix in the middle of. So you can just put food in the middle with maybe wrapped in a piece of tissue or something similar. And yeah, you can make these little toys which have the nut inside, and your rats will likely have a really great time with those. So I'm going to make a couple more of these. This is an almond in shell. And finally, we have a walnut. That makes it even more difficult to get into. And the last foraging toy that I'm going to show you how to make is a really simple one that I make all the time. And this is simply by turning the edges over like this, stuffing in some paper towel, tissue paper, hay, anything like that. And then you can add in treats, food, mix, add that into the middle, stuff in more paper, towel, paper, whatever you have to hand, and close it up. Like so. And that is a really easy foraging toy that you can make for your rats to give them a little bit of enrichment. Okie dokie, so these are the foraging toys that I made today. I hope it was helpful and gave you a little bit of inspiration about what you can use from around your house to make cool, interesting toys for your rats. You don't necessarily have to spend any money. You can reuse things and use things that were destined for the trash and make some really enriching foraging toys for your rats. I hope it was really helpful, and I hope to see you in future videos. To stick around, you can subscribe. I make videos like this, videos about my experience, I make informational videos, and I also vlog. There are lots of exciting things coming up with the inevitability of my pairing of my breeding program happening soon. And if you want to stick around and see some cute babies, I would really, really appreciate that. If you have any comments, questions, suggestions, or anything like that, do leave them down there in the comments, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks so much for watching.